Welcome to the Western Baul Podcast Series with talks on traditional spiritual teaching and its application in the world today. The intention of the series is to offer something useful for those who are drawn to study themselves and engage practice on the spiritual path. New talks are posted twice each month. The content of the talks is for informational purposes only and not to provide any kind of counseling, medical, or professional advice. This podcast is titled The Search for the Indestructible and the Basis of Fear in Us. The talk was given by V.J. Fedorschak on July 18, 2026, via Zoom. V.J. is the organizer of the Western Baul Podcast Series and author of The Shadow on the Path and Father and Son. In this presentation, he considers the question of what it is in us, if anything, that exists eternally and is indestructible. He discusses teachings of the French master Arnaud Desjardins and his own teacher Lee Lozowick, and wisdom and stories from the Hindu and Buddhist traditions. V.J. describes spiritual principles about intention and relating with fear that can be applied in our lives today. He poses questions that make the considerations raised in the talk personally relevant. If you would like to write answers to these questions, as attendees did during the live talk, just pause the recording while doing so and continue listening when finished writing. If there is benefit in this talk for you, please consider sharing the link to it or writing a review on social media or on one of the podcast platforms. V.J. Fedorschak.
There's a lot of ground to cover tonight, and if you're willing to write answers to a few questions that I would ask, I'd ask if you would get a pen and paper. And my plan is to cover some material and then ask a few questions, because I think that it would make the material more relevant to consider it personally. And you'd be welcome to share some of what you wrote or not. But I think just writing some things down about how the considerations land with you personally would be useful. Well, first of all, the title, The Search for the Indestructible and the Basis of Fear in Us. To consider the indestructible, I think we should first talk about the destructible. The destructible meaning anything that's impermanent, just pretty much everything. Anything that will not last. I mean, it's so obvious in one way, but if you actually think about it logically, we attach and try to hold on to things that are destructible. Everything that we attempt to hold on to, for the most part, is destructible. It's impermanent. It's not going to last. It's not like we shouldn't enjoy these things, but holding on to them creates suffering. So, for example, the obvious things like money, a job, relationships, photos. I was thinking about my mom when my wife and I moved her from her house that she'd lived in for 48 years. We had to go through her house, and it's just unbelievable how much stuff there was in the basement, under the ping pong table. People hadn't been through that stuff for decades. I think it was there that I found bronze baby shoes. Like, what are these doing here? Who do they belong to? They belong to me. We hold on to possessions, to things that will not last. And less tangible things, reputation, beliefs, opinions, we hold tightly to those. I'm going to see a good friend tomorrow, a delightful person. The way that she relates with her kids, she is consumed with the belief that her kids have wronged her and will hold on to that belief, even if it goes against what she's actually looking for on the spiritual path. Even our mind is destructible. That will go as well. I got a photograph that was texted to me from a distant relative showing her with a beaming smile in front of a new car that she had bought. And it's great to have a new car. But I know that if she parks in the parking lot and someone scrapes it, her disposition will change very quickly, let alone if she gets T-boned at an intersection. To appreciate what there is and hold it lightly rather than to grasp onto what is destructible would seem to make sense, but it's not how we function as human beings. Or it seems like we hope for what's not possible, to maintain things forever. Relationships, they just don't last forever. What way of relating to those things is helpful on the path? When things are going good, then we want them to keep going that way. My father had this maxim. As I was thinking about this talk, it just came to me. He said, when things are going good, the trick is to keep it that way. And we just can't force things to stay the way that they are because the nature of the universe is that it will constantly change. So I'm going to refer to a few sources tonight, but mostly I have to attribute what I'm going to say to Arnaud Desjardins, the French master, who wrote this book, among others, called Ever-Present Peace. And one of the things he says is that true hope is not about living intelligently in order to be protected to a certain degree from possible destruction. That is what everyone tries to do more or less skillfully. Isn't it true? I think about myself, even on the spiritual path. I think I try to protect my relationship to things so that they will be maintained. Of course, there's insurance policies for that. I was learning just recently that insurance goes back, quite a long way, actually. I thought that it was a modern creation. But apparently in ages past, shippers would get some kind of insurance in case their boats got blown away. But in terms of a more modern way of getting insurance, that is something that's just occurred. And so we got, what are all the kinds of insurance that you got? You got house, if you got a house. You got auto. You got health insurance. You got life insurance. If you live in a flood zone, you get flood insurance. If you got money, maybe you have umbrella insurance. I get these things in the mail like all the time that let me know monthly, I think, that there are water lines under my house and I'm responsible for them. I don't think this is a kind of insurance, but you can buy some kind of protection so that if the water lines break, they'll be covered rather than you're having to pay for it. Of course, bundling is cheaper with all these different kinds of insurance, but maybe that doesn't really get us too far on the spiritual path. I mean, it's good to have insurance. Last thing about this, I have a friend who lives pretty close by to me, and he's got a wonderful view, a beautiful view of the mountains. And he's been spending days, weeks, I think, creating defensible space by cutting all the brush away from his property in case wildfires get down this far. And I think that that's wise, but, sometimes the house just burns down. It does. I have a good friend, I would say. She's deceased now. She lived in Colorado in an area where there were, I think maybe 1,000 houses or so. And there were wildfires burning to the north. And she heard early in the day that her area was safe. No worries, just stay sheltered in place. And then toward the latter part of the day, she got a message, get out of there, like right away, right now, leave. You hear those announcements when you're on an airplane, leave all your carry-ons behind in the unlikely event that an evacuation is needed. Well, she was going to grab some things. And so she's looking for her 2 cats. One of them is there. Where is the other one? She's stomping through the house, calling for the cat, nowhere to be found. Finally, she finds it and gets them both in the car and drives out of her place. And she can't see anything. Smoke is all around. She can't see clearly in front of her. She doesn't really know if she's going to hit something as she leaves the street that her house is on. But she makes it. We fear loss of the destructible. So I want to just pose a question right here at the outset. And I'm only going to give you maybe a minute to write. So this is only to just taste some of the considerations that we'll be talking about tonight. And if you would like to fill them out later, go ahead and do that. The first question is, what are some things that are destructible, impermanent, that you are holding on to? Okay, I'm going to just leave it like that. Maybe you've written a few things down that you could certainly expand on if you want to later. In this book, Ever-Present Peace, that I mentioned, there's a chapter called That Which is Indestructible. And Arnaud says that he wants to write about some unusual ideas that are not immediately obvious. And so I'd like to mention some of those. He starts by saying that what predominates in human beings is not desire, but fear. And he says that fear is negative attraction. That actually was a statement of his teacher, Swami Prajnanpad. One of the formulas, that's what Swami Prajnanpad called these pithy statements that were really teaching maxims. And Arnaud explains that the common way that you might interpret that statement isn't really what Swami Prajnanpad was referring to. We might look on that by thinking, oh, if I'm afraid of something, I'll attract it to me. If I'm worried about having an accident, sooner or later, I'm going to have an accident because my fear is attracting that to me. He says that's not really what the statement means. He says that if we're attracted to something, we're drawn to something, it might not be something that we really desire, but if there's something that's pulling on our attention and we refuse that, there's fear. He uses an example of a priest who is attracted to a parishioner, but his vocation really doesn't allow that. So he pushes that away. He denies this attraction. And there's fear around that. I was thinking about this, how this might apply to me. And I was in the gym, go to the gym pretty much every day. And sometimes it's pretty packed. And I always like to give myself some distance from the next person if I'm on a treadmill. So not to get on the treadmill right next to them, liking my space. But this person gets on right next to me and they're coughing and sneezing and not looking real well. And I'm first a bit annoyed, but second, I realize that there's some fear in me. I don't want to get sick. Who knows? Maybe this person has COVID or whatever. So I get off the treadmill and I'm going to go to another one because there are several that are not being used in the row ahead of me. But then there are other people along that row and they are blowing their nose and I actually hold my breath down this row and then turn and go in the other direction and go into another room. And I'm like out of breath when I get there. And I'm realizing there is some fear in me about sickness. And I think what Arnaud is referring to is that there are some attractions, and in this case, I would say illness is an attraction in this way. They have power over us, but we don't agree to feel them. So to just be with that doesn't mean that I shouldn't get off my treadmill and go to another one, but can I relax with that and agree to feel whatever is going on around this attraction? He says that it's often said that all fear is about fear of death. He says that the interesting thing about fear is not only the issue of survival, but also that we fear the destruction of aspects of ourselves that we're identified with. So he uses an example of an Olympic athlete. If you have a major injury, you're done as an Olympian. Or a singer, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but really popular singers who've lost their voice for periods of time. and perhaps permanently. They would no longer be the singer of note that they've been their whole lives. And what he's saying, I think, is that we fear loss of that identity. And that's different than fear of death. And we can work with that. He does use this one example that I would like to mention. During the Great Depression, now close to 100 years ago, guys who were extremely wealthy and lost their fortunes, some of them would jump off buildings and commit suicide, even though, relatively speaking, they would still have more money than most people would. But as an elite, extremely wealthy person, they would no longer be that. And that was their identity. So then I'm thinking, maybe the reaction against immigrants a lot, maybe part of it is that people fear losing the social position that they have, the identity of someone who has this kind of social position or political power. Gosh, you see these people these days who are in Congress and they can barely walk, have to be wheeled into the chambers. They're so old, but they can't, it seems, give up their identity as someone who has this political power. Aging rockers. I was looking at a video of Mick Jagger. He's not really looking so great. He works out a lot, but Mick can't seem to let this identity go. Like, who would we be? Who are we if not that? And I think we can look at ourselves in this way too, this principle. Who do we think that we are? And who would we be if we were not that? Even people who aren't successful at all. I was reading about someone in England who had won the lottery. Some person from the lower class won about £2 million. And within a short period of time had lost it all and was back working a menial job. That was her identity. That's what she felt comfortable with. And Arnaud is bringing us to consider, who are we besides who we've identified with? I also have a good friend that I hardly ever see these days. He worked for a company that made trade show booths. So there were these trade shows. They were held in conference areas, like in Las Vegas. So electronics shows or gaming shows. There's tons of different kinds of shows. And this company made trade show booths. So the products that these companies who attended the conventions, the products that they would make, they would exhibit in these trade show booths. And this guy would go around at these conventions and give his card out and get business for the company. For new products that they were putting out, they would build new trade show booths. They would pack them up. They would store the trade show booths. That was his job. He was a salesman. And then he got hit by a vehicle on the road. And in an instant, his identity as a salesman and in so many ways as a really functional person was gone. He was paralyzed, couldn't speak. Really a shock to his family and his friends. I was in Germany maybe 4 years ago, seeing some friends over there, and his wife and him had been invited. I don't think anyone had expected them to show up. They live in Germany now. And in comes this guy's wife wheeling him in, and the room just stops, really, to acknowledge him, who most of us had not seen for a very long time. And in the course of the evening, we had a circle. So everyone just got to speak anything that they wanted to say. And this guy's wife spoke about what her life was like. Her identity had changed entirely too, as a caretaker for him, 100% of the time, all the time. Wow, what a service. And she said that they came because she knew that he wanted to come. And looking at the man, he was just extremely emotional. He couldn't speak. But you could tell that though he had died as the kind of functional person that he was, something in him continues, and he continues to do his spiritual work in the way that he can at this point. Like we might lose an identity, one that is very dear to us, but does something continue is the question for this evening. Orno says that there are testimonies of people throughout the traditions attesting to the reality that something is indestructible. And I'm thinking about Ramana Maharshi, one of the great sages of India, who, when he was on his deathbed, was radiant. And when asked about what would happen after he died, he said, "Where can I go?" Somehow he understood something that couldn't be communicated in language about what is indestructible in us. And Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar, another titan in the spiritual field, on his deathbed, people filed past the apartment that they could see into through a window. And as they were filing past, he held his hands up in blessing. And it's said, I've read this anyway, I didn't see this, but I've read that even when he was in a semi-conscious state, he would just continue raising his hands in blessing. Arnaud says that we should not start from the perspective of thinking that this should have already been accomplished. He suggests, dare to face every threatened aspect of yourself. It's the only real solution. So for me, one of the reasons why I really wanted to give this talk is because I've really thought about this. And I've considered things that generate fear in me and this recommendation to face every threatened aspect of myself. So I'm a neophyte in doing this, even with the practice of self-observation all these years. But I also think that we deepen our practice as time goes on and find things that just weren't accessible to us previously. So one idea for an exercise, entirely your call, would be for the next 3 days, write down any time that you sense fear and consider what it's about and how you might face that. Okay, so a question now. Can you think of anything that you refuse your attraction to, you recoil from, and have some fear around it?
I'm not completely clear about this fearing and my attraction to it. I still don't get it quite.
My entry point into that was illness. So I can see how part of me doesn't agree to feel, to be with my experience of fear around illness. I don't agree to be with my experience of fear around fill in the blank, whatever that might be. I read this and I really had to read it and reread it. And I personally also can't say that I totally get it. But I think that the idea about it is no denial anywhere, no denial about anything that one feels. And when one has denial about it, there is some fear. Well, that's the best I can do for now. Anyway, another question is, what parts of you and what roles in life are you identified with? Okay, good. So, next section. There doesn't seem to be anything we can do to maintain that which is destructible. That just seems clear. This is a quote. So the question, the big one, is there something, anything of me that is immortal? What remains? To consider this deeply is to search for the indestructible in us. Is there such a thing? Or is this, a fairy tale, imagination? Let me read a little bit. He says, All spiritual teachings dare to affirm immortality and eternal life. The most well-known prayer in the Upanishads ends with Ma Amritam Gamayo. From death, lead me to immortality, or non-death. Let's translate. From all that is destructible, lead us to what is indestructible. Call it atman, non-born, eternal life, absolute, or God in you. Shortly after I heard about spiritual teaching, which just rocked my world, I'd never heard anything like this. I read the Upanishads, a very slim book of, I think, 10 of the Upanishads. I think that there are maybe 108 of them. And the history of them is pretty interesting. They go way back to times before Christ, supposedly developed by rishis or seers who just had insight into the nature of reality. And they were passed on orally for hundreds of years and written down, as I recall, sometime 300 to 700 BCE or something like this. They had been passed on orally for such a long time. And I remember reading about these terms, like what does the atman mean? Pure consciousness, what is that? In you, in me as an individual, the essence of consciousness. Like, what does that mean? And then Brahman, which is all-pervading reality, like all of this. And in the Upanishads, it's mentioned that the atman is Brahman. They're one and the same. How is that possible? What does that mean exactly? These Upanishads contain stories. I remember one of them being about Nachiketa, who asks the king of death, what is beyond death? And the king tells him, he says, ask for anything else, ask for any other boon. He grants him some boons because Nachiketa comes to his house and he's not there and he has to wait 3 days. And then when he comes back, he says, okay, I'll grant you 3 boons because you had to wait 3 days. And that's what Nachiketa wants to know. And then the king of death, Yama, begins this discourse about the Atman and Brahman. I also remember a talk that my teacher, Lee Lozowick, gave on the cosmology of death. Just seemed like extemporaneous, where he spoke about how one part of us utterly fears death and has some primal drive to survive. And another part of us courts death. I couldn't really make the jump to consider how I did that so much, but I did get how that's done in the world. Like people race cars 200 miles an hour, try to climb Mount Everest. Why would you do that? Numbers of people die every year trying to make that climb and things like that. And the use of alcohol and drugs, that's certainly going to kill you. We've said in talking about this that we court death because part of us knows that survival is not an issue. And that if we actually died and realized that we weren't dead, then we could relax. We wouldn't live in utter fear of our survival if we knew that we were going to survive. Arnaud talks about the state of deep sleep, like of who we are at a fundamental level. Consider that in the deep heart of night, in dreamless sleep, that some consciousness exists, perhaps not identified. I can't say for sure, but I get the point that it's not so far from us. I don't know if you would call that the Atman or pure consciousness, but it does seem that this truth of a non-identified consciousness is in us. Arnaud says that emotions like fear have actually disappeared in the sage. So then I would think, well, that seems like it would be a boring life. But he says that they've been replaced by higher feelings, peace, equanimity, love that has no contrary. So we're considering the search for the indestructible in us. And for me, just looking at pictures, photos, murtis of spiritual masters, realizers, really seems to communicate that there is something beyond death that they're in touch with. At least that's how it seems to me. Arnaud was telling a story about how during World War II, soldiers who were maimed, had to have limbs amputated, just horrific kind of situations, would be moved to an abandoned church. He was saying that, I think it's Paul Brunton, who wrote at least one book about Ramana Maharshi, wrote this book about World War II and about these soldiers. Their painful cries were so difficult. But in the deep part of night at 3 a.m., everything was silent. It seems that no matter what, we return to this silence in us. Perhaps we're destined to do that. And how that happens, how to live from that context in the midst of activity, to me is a great mystery. But it seems to happen according to the traditions. So, a question. Do you recall experiencing the indestructible in you or having an intuition of it? Okay. The path seems to be about being true to our situation as it exists here and now. Living from the indestructible, though it may be in us, is not where we are at right now. Today, I'm identified as this guy holding on to these things. I see them and I can work with them just by being with that. And part of this identification and part of being this guy is having psychological pathologies. So this is something that comes from my teacher that also really struck me and seems to fit for me. First, I don't think that working through all of our psychology is imperative on the path, but I think that being able to manage it is imperative. Of course, otherwise it can consume all of our attention and energy. And also, it's just liable to pop up and be hurtful. What controls me, especially in ways that I don't see? Are there deeply ingrained drives that haven't been fully examined, to be powerful, to fill a hole in myself? I really think that when those kind of things predominate or own us, we can be fixated in ways that keep us from looking more deeply into ourselves and searching for the indestructible. Also, I think that if we do have an experience of the indestructible, and it's real, if we haven't dealt with our psychological pathologies, I think that they can just leak out and cause harm. And we've seen this with some teachers around power and sex, even when there's some real experience, perhaps, of the indestructible. And they come up for all of us, too. It's not just that these scandals have gone on. I think we're in the same boat because we're human beings, needing to look at ourselves, at our own psychological pathologies. Maybe some people, that's not such a big deal for them. Maybe for some people it is. And it's an important part of their work. My teacher said that one-pointed intention is the only thing that can manage the subconscious mind. So with certain psychological dynamics that I see in myself, to me, I would have to have one-pointed intention to search for the indestructible without getting caught in all these snares of different psychological pathologies, of a couple different ones that really are powerful in me. That would be the kind of intention that the Buddha had, sitting under the Bodhi tree. But we said that we can't have one-pointed intention if we're split. So one part of us wants one thing and one part of us wants another. So, for example, one part of us wants to search deeply for the indestructible. And one part of us wants to hold on to things that are destructible. Not possible to have full intention that's needed to find the indestructible in us if we're split. So that really brought me to think about that. I see a similar point made by Arnaud Desjardins. He says that it's like being between two chairs when you don't make a decision about something. And this can be on a very unconscious level. We could make a distinction between the subconscious and the unconscious. Subconscious is much more readily accessible. There are things that we can recall fairly easily. And the unconscious are full of drives and motivations that are much less accessible to us, but that motivate us. And sometimes the terms are used interchangeably. But when there's an unconscious drive in one direction and a conscious drive in another direction, which do you think is going to win out? And so coming to terms with that, or seeing that clearly and working with that, I think is really important on the path. And identifying what those things might be that we're split about. Arnaud says, being between two chairs, that's the way he describes it, is disastrous to your progression on the path. You are not free. Years are passing by. And I see that. I see that there are some issues that have continued for years. I could say that some progress has been made, but that split still exists. So here's a question. In what area or areas are you split with conflicting impulses? What psychological pathologies get activated in you? What happens when they get activated? Is there a pattern in it? And one more question. When have you had one-pointed intention? Do you have a reference point for that? Okay. And then sometimes the house burns down and we're faced with reality beyond philosophy that everything relative is destructible. We really experience that. It's not in our mind. We viscerally have the experience of that. And when there's a shock, in the aftershock, I think that we see things that have been hidden. We see the splits in us more clearly. At least that has been my experience. Things that had not been very clear to me about the way that I'm split became much more obvious. So I don't think I'll speak about my personal situation so much, but that's been some impetus for me to dig into this teaching. But it's also obvious that loss really affects my identity, affects our identity. That clinging to the destructible is really not an option because we have lost that which we were clinging to, and that's not coming back. So there can be grief, not only about losing someone, if you lose an intimate partner, for example, as I have, but also about losing part of oneself. I've lost a part of myself that's a husband, at least in this realm, in this physical time and place. That relative part of myself has been destroyed. What remains? It's not that we should hold back, recognizing that everything is impermanent and try to keep from getting hurt. It seems like life is teaching us. And there's grief. So there's this story that some of you, I'm sure, have heard of Kisa Gautami. She was a mother in ancient India, and her child got sick and died. He was a toddler. And a neighbor suggested that she would go to the Buddha because there's nothing that she could do, the neighbor. And the mother held on to the child, kept the child with her, the dead baby, and went from person to person, asking for help, for a miracle, to revive her child. And then she ended up going to the Buddha with the child. And in his compassion, the Buddha said that he could help. He told her to go to houses in the village and to get a mustard seed from a family that had not experienced death. And she went house to house, and no one could give her a mustard seed because every family had, of course, experienced loss like that. And in one version of the story, night is falling, and she's holding her baby, and she's watching the lights in the village go out one by one, presumably fires at that time in ancient India. And that metaphor provoked in her the consideration that our lights all go out and everyone dies, that is part of being a human. And she returns to the Buddha after having buried her child and becomes his student, becomes a nun. So another question: have you experienced a loss or anything that has changed you irrevocably, brought you in contact with the reality of the destructible? What was your experience and how were you changed as a result? I would say that loss or grief, when one really gets that what we've attached to and are holding on to is destructible, that there's some irrevocable change that happens for one, as happened for Kisa Gautami. So, seeing the hopelessness of clinging to the destructible, however that happens for us, can catalyze a deeper search for the indestructible. I think that that's true. I think that when we're out of options, when the things that we're holding on to are shown to us really to not hold ultimate possibility for us, our impulse is to look, to search more deeply for the indestructible, beyond the philosophy of it. Arnaud says that there comes a time when you can change your approach and center yourself on the essential. I think he's saying that all the work that we do with our feelings and with improving our relationships and being with what is all really useful, important preparatory work. But he says that there comes a time when we really will center our focus on the indestructible, wanting to find that in ourselves. And because it's really a topic that concerns several people that I know, I wanted to read this section on how to apply these teachings if and when there is cognitive decline. Because this to me is something that I haven't heard before, something that isn't immediately obvious that Arnaud is writing about here. So he says, the path to wisdom is not a guarantee against the deterioration of the cerebral function. It is obvious that when your intellectual function betrays you, perhaps you go to pick up the phone, but at the very moment you want to dial, you have forgotten who you wanted to talk to. One must dare the yes, the absolute yes. If you are angry with yourself, if you worry, if you add a useless refusal, you make your condition worse. So train yourself immediately, in italics, to the madness of the yes. You know, I talk to a lot of people about practice, about saying yes. And then when we get to the topic of cognitive decline in someone, oftentimes the mood of that is that there is a problem that we need to fix if it's at all possible. And Arnaud is suggesting a way of practicing with this that I had not considered before. He says, the idea that we can be destroyed in one or another aspect of ourselves with which we are identified is capital. You may totally be able to bear that whatever you have may be destroyed if you are not affected in your being. So what you have are your mental faculties. So the cerebral function itself may deteriorate, but the function of the heart, peace, compassion, serenity, is indestructible when the heart is disengaged from emotions, from desires that, when not achieved, are the cause for suffering, and from fears projected onto the future. The whole meaning of your process is to allow this indestructible to be revealed in you. So I'm reading this as the indestructible exists in people with Alzheimer's and with dementia. And if I would find myself in that circumstance, that this would be a way of practicing with that. Now, whether I could do that is questionable at this point, but the idea, I think, of study and of considering the material that we cover in these talks is that we practice and we build capacity. Spiritual teachings talk about an astonishing spiritual discovery. We must ask, is it true, or is it only a questionable idea? Generation after generation, some human beings, men and women, have affirmed that they have checked the truth of Buddha's words or have discovered the indestructible treasures evoked by the gospel. Search for the absolute. You will not find it at the physical level or at the intellectual level, but at the level of the heart. Identification means mistaking yourself for something you are not really. But what you absolutely are, you cannot not be. You cannot anymore not be it. I am is eternal. It's really clear to me what's been said many times, that understanding is the booby prize. That truly embodying realization is possible. It may not be, or it may be in the cards in this one lifetime. But what else is worth giving our attention to but the path? Okay, last point, and then I'd like to open it up for discussion. The slow-moving caterpillar can sense its impending transformation. At some point, we sense that the sun is rising. And if I can sense the indestructible in me, if I just have some intuition of that, that can inform my life. And so I'm feeling that in a couple different ways. One is in terms of generosity. It's one thing to say we're all one and we're on the path and I can give of myself some things. But I think that if I sense the indestructible in myself, I can give much more freely. And that can be in terms of money or time. For me, especially in terms of attention. Somebody calls me up and they want to talk. Go for it. I can put down what it is that's so important that I'm doing for a few minutes. I need to make a boundary if it goes too long, but I can relax and be generous. And self-importance, it seems like such an illusion if I consider the indestructible in me, because it's in everyone. This idea of getting off it, if I've got an attitude towards somebody or I'm thinking in an arrogant way, really? That's totally useless and it's false. And in terms of having the courage to face fear, it seems like if this is the truth, if facing our fears is a way of opening to the indestructible, not pushing away feelings towards something that attracts my attention, being able to be with that. Not that I wouldn't leave a situation, but can I feel what's going on? Can I be open and then act accordingly? Sometimes that requires some courage. And it takes courage for me to face aspects of myself that I'm identified with when they're not substantiated. If I'm in a situation where I'm ignored completely, to relax with that. and to remember the teaching. All right, now I'm going to read one last quote, and that will conclude what I wanted to say tonight. Thank you so much for listening. Orno says, in ever-present peace, you may already be discovering the dawning of this realization, of the indestructible. Perhaps the sun has not yet risen in the east, but the horizon is clearer. The inner sun may not yet be ready to rise, but you feel you have the presentiment of its arising at some depth in yourself, at another level. You have a glimpse of this eternal present moment. Dharma is irreplaceable to me, to give my attention to and reflect on.
I'm on a path, I've been on it for a long time, where it talks about when the body dies and we go on. I guess my fear is that when the body dies, I'll go asleep until I come back. And I'll have to go through some of this again.
Oh my God. Sometimes I think about that and I say, I'm really going to practice because no, I don't want to do this again. But then I have to kind of chill and relax. There's no way that I'm going to know or I'm going to be able to set anything up the way that I want. I can't control it. Just to go with it and to bring my intention to my practice and my motivation to practice. Like, what is that? What would you say your motivation to practice is?
To get to a place of quiet mind, where I was at peace. I'd like to be able to take that with me. Or find that when I'm gone, when I leave the body.
Yeah, I'd really like to experience it now, too. One of the things that Arnaud says is that, okay, in deep sleep, you may touch this state, be in this state of pure consciousness, awareness, dreamless sleep. And he's asking the question, can that be brought into everyday life?
And I'm told the answer is yes, and I'm working at it.
Yeah, how that comes about to me is a mystery. But it does seem to happen.
Yeah.
I don't know that I can make it happen, but it does seem to happen.
Yeah, what moved me was the language of the heart, because everything in my world is trying to work things out through the mind and to develop a consistency of moving into the body, moving into the heart. What's feeding the heart? And how can I keep nurturing the heart as the mechanism of choice or the mechanism of motivation? The mind wants to do crazy, crazy, crazy things. I'm a fearful flyer on an airplane, and I'm in the shuttle going to the airport, and I'm thinking about the possibility that I'll miss the plane, that the plane will crash, that I won't get through security. And then it happened to remember that it was the anniversary of Jerry's death. And I began to fall into the heart of that moment. And all the fear about the airplane just went away. So I entered the airport in the mood of my love and heartbreak and joy of him. So I got a firsthand example of what those two different modes of understanding could be.
Yeah. The default for me is the mind also thinking. And then I catch myself sometimes. We've covered a lot of Dharma that's useful, I think, to think about. But right now, can I fall into the heart? Yeah, I don't know if I can do that, but just to remember that's really my connection. It's not understanding these things. And what I'm trying to do in my daily life is more about being heart connected to things rather than any outer activity. Thank you for the reminder. So maybe I could just even actually experience that for a moment with everyone here.
You are talking about Alzheimer's, which is predominantly a condition of the mind. It's deterioration of the mind. When I was a caregiver, at one point I was working in a home where people with that kind of condition were being kept because they were no longer able to stay at home. And I was working with a man who, he had been a very prominent businessman, and he was in a condition where he could no longer remember. He couldn't speak. He couldn't answer questions. He could eat. He couldn't dress himself. and he couldn't control his bowels. When his wife came to visit him, they just stood there, each of them just crying, because they were connected. To me, that is my reminding factor of the power of love over the mind. I mean, talk about falling into the heart. I think that's where we're connected. If there's anything in me that's indestructible, I would say it would be to find where there is a place of conscience in myself and a place of love, because there's always an opening there. Talking about flying, I can drive, and my habit body is so attuned to driving a car, but that fear factor is always there. And I think that that's a survival mechanism. So I don't think that fear is always a negative thing. I mean, I get road rage sometimes. If somebody cuts me off in traffic, yep, there it is. There's that. There's that fear coming back.
Yeah, well, we're probably not in touch with the indestructible when we're in road rage.
So you were talking about resisting. So that was one of the things I wrote down is, when am I resisting? That's when I resist, when I feel vulnerable. So in order to soften into that, that's a real point of practice for me, is to be able to know when those places are. And sometimes they're just very quiet moments.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm feeling undefended. And I'm not defending myself. What does that say about the rest of the time? Oh.
Well, you have a lot of experience with self-observation, so...
Well, this fear of death, this idea of life after death, it's nothing I can verify. So part of the practice of self-observation is, can I verify? I can't experience that. I can only go up to a certain point. I have been with people who have died right there with me, but I cannot go beyond that point. Yeah, yes. I will.
Yeah, but something that we can practice with is fear of losing parts of ourselves that we're identified with.
Yeah.
We can work with that kind of death in life. I think that that's a very valuable consideration.
Right. So what exists in life that I'm able to experience that I can verify? So the practice of letting go of identification is a practice of dying. It is.
Die before you die. Yeah. That idea.
Those are very poetic words and all that, but the thing is, when it arrives, then it's really real. And there's a sensation that goes with that. Mm-hmm. And that can be observed.
Mm-hmm. Well, Arnaud seems like he's pointing in a direction where this process goes. Not limited to this lifetime, I assume. But he says that fear can disappear. Fear does disappear at some point. And that's really pretty amazing to consider. He says that in black and white. And when I have looked at realizers, I've read about them, or in some cases, I think really seen them in relationship to the dying process, it does feel as if fear is gone. And he says it's replaced with love. There's fear or there's love. As he said, it's not like we should look on things as if this is something that we should have already accomplished to be in this place. Mm. But to me, it's very heartening to know a direction that this is going in and to have some intuition of it, not just because somebody told me that.
I like the word heartening.
Oh, yes. And the heart being what it is that brings us through. It's certainly not going to be the mind.
2 quick stories of Arnaud that verify what he's been talking about. One was when he traveled to Quebec from France one trip. And when he arrived with the party of people who came with him, they were all dragging their butts into the place where they were staying. And somebody looked at Arnaud and they said to him, "You look as fresh as a daisy." And Arnaud looked at them and he said, "No resistance." And then the other example I have from Arnaud, the story that I was told, is that he was actually diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And his nephew, on that same day that he was with him when he got the diagnosis, said to him, "How is that settling with you?" And he said, "I need a day or two to be with this." And he came back 2 days later and he said, yes. Said, yes. And what happened was it was a misdiagnosis. He didn't have Alzheimer's. He had a heart condition. But he knew that it would take him a little bit of time where he could actually face this diagnosis and be able to say yes. That was his whole sadhana, was yes. Blows me away every time I think of those two stories.
Sometimes people have a view about teachers as if they're giving up their autonomy if they are with one, or their decision-making abilities. I find that to find someone who is further along the path, in some cases way further, and has walked the talk is so invaluable. Otherwise, I would be trying to figure these things out in my mind without having a visceral sense of what this is really all about. It occurs to me that this idea of the indestructible, this term, I relate that to a real I. What I actually is whatever is indestructible in us. And it goes by many different names in the different traditions, but that's my take on it. And to consider, it's just so really mind-blowing that it's here all the time. I guess you would say, in a dualistic way, it's in us, but it is here. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate the opportunity to share some things that seem really key to the path.